They say old houses have secrets, but I never expected to find one quite like this. A routine plumbing job unearthed a chilling message, a tiny tooth, and a name that would haunt me forever. My knuckles were raw, and my back ached in that familiar dull way it always does after an hour hunched over a stubborn drain. The air in Mrs. Gable's basement was thick and heavy, a cocktail of damp earth, mildew, and the faint, sweet scent of decay that old houses collect like memories. It was the kind of smell you never quite get used to, but you learn to ignore. I've been a plumber for 15 years. I've snaked out things from pipes that would make a surgeon gag. I've pulled out matted clumps of hair the size of small animals, retrieved wedding rings, car keys, and once, a very confused-looking hamster that thankfully survived the ordeal. I thought I'd seen it all. I was wrong. The job was supposed to be simple. A slow drain in the basement utility sink. Mrs. Gable, a woman who seemed to be made entirely of lace, wrinkles, and the scent of lavender, had explained it with a trembling, wispy voice. "It's been that way for years, dear," she'd said, her pale blue eyes darting around as if the walls themselves might be listening. "I never come down here anymore. Just make it stop gurgling, won't you?" The gurgling was the least of her problems. This wasn't a slow drain. It was a full-on blockage, solid and unyielding. My standard hand-cranked snake hit it with a dull thud and refused to go any further. I switched to the power auger, the one I call the Persuader. Its heavy-duty cable whirred to life, chewing its way down the ancient cast-iron pipe. For 20 minutes it was a battle. The motor would strain, the cable would grind and screech, and then I'd pull it back, the coiled steel head bringing up nothing but black, foul-smelling sludge. Whatever was down there was lodged tight, a Gordian knot of filth and time. Mrs. Gable had offered me tea, but her hands were shaking so badly the cup rattled in its saucer. I'd politely declined. There was something about her nervousness that put me on edge. It was more than just the anxiety of having a stranger in her house. It was a deeper, more brittle fear, the kind you see in people who are terrified of something being discovered. I chalked it up to old age, to a lonely woman in a cavernous, creaking house full of shadows. Again, I was wrong. Finally, on the 5th or 6th attempt with the power auger, I felt a change. The grinding sound turned into a scraping, tearing noise. The motor whined at a higher pitch, and then, with a violent shudder that vibrated up the cable and into my hands, something broke free. A wave of relief washed over me. I hate being beaten by a clog. I reversed the motor, the cable slowly retracting, dragging its prize up from the guts of the house. The stench that followed it was obscene, a putrid wave of stagnant water and rot that hit me so hard I actually gagged, my eyes watering. I pulled the auger head clear of the drain opening. It was a horrifying mass, a tangled sphere of black slime, grime, and what looked like decades of compacted stuff. It's always the worst part of the job, cleaning the snake. I laid a tarp on the concrete floor, grabbed a pair of pliers and a bucket, and started pulling the mess apart. First came the hair, long strands of it, dark and unnaturally preserved by the anaerobic environment of the pipe. It was mixed with thick, greasy deposits and what looked like shreds of fabric, so decayed they turned to mush in my gloved fingers. This was all standard, disgusting, but standard. I kept pulling, untangling the foul nest, and that's when my pliers hit something hard. It wasn't a rock. It had a uniform shape. Curious, I worked it free from the clinging hair and sludge. It was a small metal box, tarnished almost black. I rinsed it under the trickle of water from the faucet I'd just cleared. As the grime washed away, I saw that it wasn't a box. It was a locket. Silver, or at least it had been once. It was heart-shaped, with intricate floral engravings around the edges, the kind of thing a young girl might have worn 100 years ago. The chain was long gone, but the locket itself was intact, held shut by a small, delicate clasp. My first thought was that it was Mrs. Gable's, or maybe belonged to her mother. Something precious, lost down the drain by accident ages ago. A little piece of history coughed up by the house. I fiddled with the clasp, my thick fingers clumsy against the tiny mechanism. It was stuck fast with corrosion. I gave it a little nudge with the tip of my pliers and it popped open with a faint click. I expected to see a faded, water-damaged photograph, a miniature portrait of a stern-faced man with a mustache, or a woman with her hair in a bun. My heart was pounding a little, the way it does when you find something that feels like it has a story, but there was no photograph inside. On one side of the heart, nestled into the velvet lining that had turned a sickly brown, was a tiny, tightly folded piece of paper. On the other side was a single, small, pearly white object. It took my brain a full 10 seconds to process what I was looking at. It was a tooth, a baby tooth, small and perfect, with the delicate scalloped edge of an incisor. A chill, completely separate from the basement's damp cold, snaked its way up my spine. Who puts a tooth in a locket? I carefully used the tip of a screwdriver to pry out the folded piece of paper. It was fragile, almost transparent with age and saturation. I painstakingly unfolded it on my knee. There was writing on it, a child's scrawl in faded blue ink. Just 2 words. Find me. My blood turned to ice, my breath hitched in my throat. This wasn't a keepsake. It was a message. A desperate plea from the past, swallowed by a drain. I stared at the locket, the tooth, the note, and my mind reeled. What kind of story was this? Who was this child? Suddenly, the normal creaks and groans of the old house sounded sinister. The dripping of the faucet I'd just fixed sounded like a countdown. I shoved the locket and its contents into my pocket, a sudden primal need to hide it overwhelming me. I turned back to the disgusting pile on the tarp, my hands shaking. I had to finish the job. Get out of this house. I grabbed the last, thickest clump of hair and gunk to toss it in the bucket. It was heavier than the rest. There was something else tangled in it, something that the auger had snagged along with the locket. I pulled the hair away, my stomach churning. It was a strip of dark, stiff material. I thought it was just more rotted cloth until I saw the small, rusted buckle and the loop on the end. It was a collar, a small leather collar, the kind you'd put on a cat or a small dog. My brain tried to rationalize it, to find the mundane explanation. A pet's collar fell down the drain. Simple. But then I saw the tag. A little, circular piece of metal, green with tarnish. I rubbed it frantically with my thumb, scraping away the grime. Faint letters began to appear, etched into the surface. It wasn't a pet's name. It wasn't Fluffy or Spot. There, on the tag, was one word. A name. Lily. And at that exact moment, from directly above me, a floorboard in the kitchen creaked. Then another. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming towards the basement door. Mrs. Gable. The sweet, fragile old woman was coming down, and the lavender scent I'd associated with her suddenly smelled like funeral flowers. My hand snapped shut, crushing the filthy collar in my fist. I shoved it deep into my jeans pocket, the cold, tarnished metal of the tag pressing against my skin. The basement door at the top of the wooden stairs groaned open, spilling a parallelogram of weak kitchen light onto the dusty floor. Her silhouette appeared, stooped and frail. For a heart-stopping second, all I could see was a black shape against the light, a void in the form of a little old lady. Young man? Her voice, thin as a spider's thread, floated down into the gloom. Is everything all right? I heard the machine stop. I forced my own voice to work, praying it wouldn't shake. I cleared my throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. All finished, Mrs. Gable. It was a stubborn one, but the drain's clear now. I stood up slowly, trying to make my movements seem casual, normal. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to bolt up the stairs and out into the daylight, but I was trapped by the simple rules of civilized behavior. I had a job to finish. I had a bill to give her. She began her descent, one hand gripping the rickety wooden railing, her feet shuffling cautiously from step to step. The single bare bulb hanging from a rafter cast long, dancing shadows that made her face a mask of light and dark. Her pale blue eyes, which had seemed merely vacant before, were now fixed on me with an unnerving intensity. They weren't darting around anymore. They were scanning me, scanning the floor, scanning the pile of gunk on the tarp. "Oh, good," she said, her voice a little stronger now that she was closer. She reached the bottom step and took a hesitant step onto the concrete, her floral housecoat seeming to absorb the little light in the room. "It's been making such dreadful noises. A house this old. It has so many stories, so many noises." She smiled, but it was a tight, bloodless thing that didn't touch the coldness in her eyes. "Did you find anything?" The question hung in the damp air between us, heavy and suffocating. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. She knows. The thought was irrational, impossible, but I couldn't shake it. She had to know. Why else would she ask that? People ask if you found their lost ring, not if you found anything. "Just the usual, ma'am," I said, my voice sounding strained to my own ears. I gestured vaguely at the black sludge on the tarp. "Years of hair, grease, that sort of thing. The pipe is old. I'd recommend replacing this whole section eventually. But it'll hold for now." I was babbling, filling the silence with plumber talk, hoping it sounded professional and boring. She nodded slowly, her gaze lingering on the pile of filth. It was as if she were looking for something specific in the disgusting mess. For a moment I was terrified she'd see the impression of the locket or the collar, that she could somehow divine their absence. "Yes," she whispered, more to herself than to me. "So many things get lost in this house." She looked back at me, her head tilted. "Well, I'll let you clean up. Come up to the kitchen when you're ready, and I'll get you your payment." She turned and began her slow, deliberate ascent back up the stairs. I didn't breathe until the basement door clicked shut, plunging me back into near darkness. My legs felt weak, and I leaned against the cold, damp stone wall for support. My hand was still in my pocket, clutching the collar so tightly the tag was digging into my palm. I worked as fast as I ever have in my life, scooping the remaining sludge into the bucket, rolling up the tarp, and packing my tools. My movements were frantic, clumsy. I kept glancing at the door at the top of the stairs, expecting it to fly open at any second. The lavender scent she'd left behind now seemed thick and cloying, like it was coating the back of my throat. I carried my gear up the stairs, my heavy boots thudding on the wood. The kitchen was immaculate, a stark contrast to the basement's decay. Sunlight streamed through a window over the sink, illuminating dancing dust motes. Mrs. Gable was sitting at a small formica table, a checkbook and a pen laid out before her. "Thank you so much, dear," she said, not looking up as she began to write. I set my toolbox down by the back door, my escape route. I just wanted the check and to be gone. While she wrote, my eyes scanned the room. Tacked to a corkboard by the phone were yellowed photos. A man who must have been her husband, stern-faced and long gone. A black and white wedding photo. And a faded color photograph of a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, with dark, messy hair cut into a short bob, and enormous dark eyes that seemed to stare right through the camera, right through the years, and land on me. She had a gap-toothed smile and was holding a scruffy-looking gray cat. Around her small neck, she was wearing a simple leather cord. It took me a second to see what was hanging from it. A small, heart-shaped silver locket. My blood didn't just run cold, it froze solid in my veins. My gaze snapped from the photo to Mrs. Gable. She had finished writing the check and was tearing it carefully along the perforation, but she was watching me. Her smile was gone. Her face was a placid, unreadable mask of wrinkles. "That was my niece," she said, her voice perfectly even, betraying nothing. "Lily." The name hit me like a physical blow. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. It was all I could do to stand there and not betray the storm of horror and adrenaline that was raging inside me. Lily. Not a cat, not a dog. A little girl. A little girl from a photograph, who wore a silver locket and whose name was on a collar I had pulled from the guts of this very house. She stayed with me one summer, a long, long time ago, Mrs. Gable continued, her eyes still locked on mine. She folded the check in half and held it out. Such a wild child. Always running off, getting into things, always losing her little treasures. I reached out and took the check. My hand was shaking so badly I was surprised she didn't comment on it. My fingers brushed hers. Her skin was as cold and dry as old paper. All the pieces were slotting together in my head, forming a picture so monstrous I could barely look at it. The locket, the tooth, the plea to be found, the collar, the drain that had been blocked for years, the sweet cloying smell of decay in the basement. "Right," I managed to croak, folding the check and shoving it into my pocket without even looking at it. "Well, I'll just get my gear and be out of your hair." "You do that," she said softly. Her gaze drifted past me, towards the basement door, and a flicker of something nostalgia, regret, satisfaction, passed through her eyes before they became placid once more. Every step I took towards the back door felt like I was wading through mud. The weight of the secret in my pocket was immense, a physical burden. I could feel her watching me, her cold, quiet stare boring into my back. I grabbed my toolbox, my hands slick with sweat on the plastic handle. I didn't dare look at her again. I just wanted the door to be open and the sun to be on my face. "Drive safely, dear," she called after me, her voice once again the wispy, fragile thing it had been when I arrived. "It was so good of you to finally make the old house quiet again." The words echoed in my ears as I practically fell out the back door and onto the sun-drenched porch. The door clicked shut behind me. I didn't stop moving until I reached my van, throwing the toolbox in the back and scrambling into the driver's seat. I jammed the key in the ignition and locked the doors, the heavy thunk of the locks sounding like the most beautiful noise I had ever heard. I sat there for a full minute, my chest heaving, my heart trying to beat its way out of my ribcage. I stared at the house in my rearview mirror. A quaint, quiet little house on a sunny street with a monster inside. My hand, trembling uncontrollably, went into my pocket. I pulled out the locket and the collar and laid them on the passenger seat. In the bright, unforgiving light of day, they looked even more sinister. The locket, tarnished and dented. The collar, dark and stiff with age. The name Lily etched onto the tag. A message in a bottle, sent up from a tomb of cast iron and filth. I had to do something. I couldn't just drive away. This wasn't a lost wedding ring. This was a child. I pulled out my phone, my fingers fumbling on the screen. I didn't know what to do. Call the police? What would I say? That I found some old trinkets in a drain? They'd think I was crazy. I needed something more, something concrete. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I typed the address of the house into the search bar, followed by the words, "missing girl." My signal was weak. The search icon spun for what felt like an eternity. And then the results loaded. There were only a few, most of them irrelevant real estate listings. But the third one down made my breath catch in my throat. It was a link to the digital archives of the local newspaper. The headline was stark and horrifying. "Fears grow for Lily Gable, 6, missing for a week." The date on the article was October 12th, 1978, over 40 years ago. I clicked the link, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone steady. The page loaded, showing a scan of the original newsprint, yellowed and grainy. There was a photo of the girl from the corkboard, her dark eyes haunting me from across the decades. I read the article, my mind racing, my stomach twisting into a painful knot. It told the story of a little girl who had vanished from her aunt's backyard without a trace. The aunt, Eleanor Gable, was her sole guardian. An extensive search had been launched. Police and volunteers had scoured the woods, the neighbors' yards, the entire town. Nothing. The article was full of quotes from a bewildered police chief and tearful neighbors. Towards the end, it detailed the search of the house itself. Lead investigator Detective Miller stated that the house at 217 Oak Street has been searched from top to bottom multiple times. "We have found no signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle," Miller was quoted as saying. "It's as if the little girl just vanished into thin air." I scrolled down, my thumb smearing the screen. I was looking for something, anything, a detail that would confirm the terrible truth solidifying in my gut. And then I found it. The last paragraph. The final few lines of the report. A detail that had been a minor, puzzling footnote in a cold case for 40 years, but to me, right now, it was a screaming confession. Miss Gable told investigators that her niece had recently developed a severe fear of the basement, the article read. She said Lily had been complaining about a monster in the walls that made angry gurgling noises, and that the child had steadfastly refused to go down there for any reason in the days leading up to her disappearance. The gurgling noises. My professional life is built around understanding gurgling noises. It's the sound of a blockage, the sound of a pipe gasping for air, the sound I had been called here to fix, the sound the house had been making for 40 years. Lily wasn't hearing a monster in the walls. She was hearing the plumbing struggling to swallow the evidence. Suddenly, I knew what I had to do. This wasn't about a hunch anymore. This was about evidence. The locket, the collar, the tooth, the note, they were Lily's last words, a final, desperate attempt to be found. And the newspaper article was the Rosetta Stone that translated their meaning. My fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in my gut, but it was being eclipsed by a white-hot wave of anger. Mrs. Gable hadn't just gotten away with it. She had turned Lily's final resting place into a common household nuisance, an inconvenient plumbing issue to be silenced by a man in dirty coveralls. The arrogance of it, the sheer icy cruelty, was staggering. I put the van in drive, but I didn't pull away from the curb. I pulled into the driveway of the house next door. An elderly man was watering his petunias, and he looked up startled as I strode across his lawn. "Sorry to bother you, sir," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "My name is Mike. I'm a plumber. I was just working at Mrs. Gable's house." "Oh, Eleanor," he said, squinting at her house. "Keeps to herself, that one. Everything all right with the old pipes?" "Sir, this is going to sound crazy," I said, lowering my voice. "Do you remember a little girl named Lily who went missing from that house a long time ago?" The man's face changed. The friendly neighborhood curiosity vanished, replaced by a shadow of old sadness. "Of course. I was just a young man myself. Helped with the search parties. Terrible thing. Shook this whole street to its core. We looked everywhere. Never found a trace." "I think I found something," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I took out my phone and showed him the article. His eyes widened as he read. Then I showed him the picture I'd quickly snapped of the locket, the tooth, and the collar laid out on my passenger seat. His face went pale. "My God," he breathed, staring at the collar. I remember that. The little girl wore it like a necklace, said it was for her cat, but she loved it so much she wore it herself. Eleanor always told her it was unladylike. That was it. That was the last piece I needed. A witness. Someone who could corroborate this wasn't just some random junk I'd pulled from a drain. I called 911. I explained who I was, where I was, and what I had found as calmly as I could. I told them about the newspaper article. I told them about the neighbor. To my immense relief, they didn't dismiss me. They told me to stay right where I was and not to approach the house. Within 10 minutes, the quiet suburban street was transformed. 2 patrol cars arrived first, their lights off, coasting to a stop a few houses down. I met the officers, a man and a woman who looked at me with a mixture of skepticism and intense focus. I laid out the items on the hood of my van, the locket and collar glinting in the sun. I told them the whole story, from the moment I switched on the power auger to Mrs. Gable's chilling final words. As I spoke, showing them the article on my phone and pointing to the neighbor who was now talking to another officer, I saw their skepticism melt away, replaced by a grim understanding. A detective in a rumpled suit arrived in an unmarked car. He was older, his face etched with the kind of weariness that comes from looking into the abyss for a living. He listened to my story without interruption, his eyes carefully examining the locket, the note, the collar. He bagged each item himself, handling them with a reverence that told me he knew exactly what he was looking at. "The basement drain," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "You think she's—" "The clog was about 15 feet down the main line, heading out towards the street," I said, my voice all business now. "It's an old 4-inch cast-iron pipe. Big enough." He just nodded slowly, his jaw tight. He gave an order to one of the uniformed officers, who walked calmly up to Mrs. Gable's front door and knocked. We all watched. The door opened a crack. We saw the officer speak, and then the door opened wider. Mrs. Gable stood there, a vision of floral print innocence, looking confused. She let them in. It felt like an eternity. I stood by my van, the neighbor beside me, the two of us silent witnesses to the slow unraveling of a 40-year-old crime. More cars arrived. Forensics. They carried equipment into the house. The detective came back out and walked over to me. "We're getting a warrant to bring in a camera scope and excavate the pipe if we have to," he said. "Your auger tore everything up, but we just ran a preliminary scope down the drain you cleared. The pipe is broken about 16 feet down. Looks like it was deliberately collapsed on something. We'll know for sure soon." He paused, looking at the house. "She's in there, calm as can be, offering everyone tea. Denies everything. Says Lily ran away. Always said she ran away." He didn't need to say anything more. We both knew what they were going to find in that collapsed cast-iron tomb beneath the lawn. They were going to find Lily. I never went back to 217 Oak Street. The story was all over the news a few days later. They'd excavated the pipe. Lily's small bones, tangled in the remnants of her pajamas, had been found right where I'd said they would be. The official cause of death was lost to time, but the story that emerged was one of quiet, horrific abuse at the hands of an aunt who saw her niece as a burden. Lily, a wild child who wouldn't be broken, had been silenced and hidden in the most monstrous way imaginable. Her last act on this earth was to secret her locket, her tooth, and her plea down a drain. A final, desperate message to the world. A message that took 42 years, a stubborn clog, and a plumber to deliver. Mrs. Gable, fragile Eleanor, confessed to everything. She died in prison less than a year later, a quiet end to a life of monstrous secrecy. They held a real funeral for Lily. The whole town came. Her name was etched onto a small white headstone in the local cemetery. Found. I still work as a plumber. My knuckles still get raw, and my back still aches. But something has changed. Every time I feed my snake into the dark, hidden guts of a house, I feel a chill. I think about the secrets that old walls and pipes can hold. And sometimes in the quiet of a damp basement, when a drain gurgles, I stop and I listen. I listen for the stories it's trying to tell. I listen for the whispers of the lost things, waiting to be found.